When it comes to scrambled eggs, there's a few keys you need in your back pocket to ensure success. And the first one, the most important one, I would argue, is salt. Now, I did a whole lesson on salt in Flavor 101, and I think you should go check it out because I basically rant about salt for like half an hour. Because salt is your most important flavor factor in the kitchen. Like, there's really no way around it. Like, eggs in particular really need salt because eggs are fatty. Eggs have kind of a one-note fatty egg flavor, which on its own is fine, it's good, but once you add salt, salt really wakes up that flavor, it brightens it up. It cuts through that fattiness and makes it more enjoyable. Like if you were to taste unsalted eggs and properly salted eggs side by side, like you would notice a huge difference and you would probably greatly prefer the eggs that were a little bit more salted. So when it comes to salting eggs, you want to use more salt than you think. And I would argue that you want to use twice as much salt as you normally would. And it sounds scary. And if you have health reasons for avoiding salt, then by all means, respect those. But if you're not opposed to salt, then I highly recommend you experiment with doubling the amount of salt that you use in your eggs to really heighten those flavors. And I'm going to show you in this little frying pan exactly what a generous pinch of salt is. So this is not a pinch of salt. That's just a little salt. This is a generous pinch of salt. It's about 1/4 teaspoon. And my general opinion is that you want to use at least 1/4 teaspoon for 2 eggs. I would even go a little bit more. I would do like 1/4 teaspoon with an extra generous pinch. But you know what? For your eggs, try it, experiment, and play with it and see what works for you. Another really important factor with eggs is, surprisingly, acid. And again, I have a whole acid module in Flavor 101 that you should check out. But acid is really important in eggs for a scientific reason. So if you take 2 beaten eggs and you add like 1/2 teaspoon of lemon juice or 1/2 teaspoon of vinegar or your favorite acid, whatever it might be, what happens is the pH of the eggs changes and it gives them a creamier, more palatable texture. And when they cook up, they actually stay a little bit softer. So the acid doesn't really give it that much of like an acidy flavor. And in fact, if you're only using like 1/2 teaspoon for 2 beaten eggs, like you probably won't taste it at all, especially if you've salted them properly. Between the salt and the acid, they'll kind of cancel each other out as far as flavor goes, and you won't really taste that acid. But what you will notice is that fatty one-note egg flavor is a little bit brighter. It's a little bit nicer, especially when paired with the salt. But more importantly, like I said, it'll soften your eggs up and give them a better texture. Now, when it comes to adding liquid to eggs, I know everybody loves to add milk or cream or whatever it is, and that's fine. But I would argue that you don't need to. What happens when you add more liquid to eggs and then you scramble them, or you turn them into an omelet or whatever you want to do with them, that just adds extra moisture. It doesn't really add extra flavor. And the truth is that when you add a fatty liquid to eggs that you're cooking, there's enough fat in eggs already. Eggs are super fatty. They don't need any more fat. So the only thing that you're really adding that has a practical purpose is the liquid. And that liquid needs to cook off before your eggs actually cook. So if anything else, you're actually working against yourself as you try to, cook your eggs and have them firm up so you can eat them. So I would say do not add any extra liquids to your eggs. No milk, no cream. I know some people add water, don't add that either. So we all love to add extra stuff to our scrambled eggs. I know, scrambled eggs are just like a blank canvas. It's so fun to fill them with other things. But there's some keys that you need to keep in mind when you're adding goodies to your eggs. So first, if you're adding chopped herbs, like fresh herbs, then you want to add them in the very beginning. Because you don't cook eggs to a very high temperature, you don't want them to overcook, and so the eggs never actually get hot enough to vaporize the flavor compounds in the herbs. So using fresh herbs, add them at the beginning of the eggs. You can even just whip them into your eggs when you're whipping them. Don't use dried herbs in eggs. You can, but the problem is that sometimes they don't cook all the way and you end up with little dry herb bits in your teeth and the flavor doesn't really come out because they weren't in contact with the liquid and fat enough, and it's kind of a nightmare. Now, if you're adding meat, like chopped bacon or chopped ham, you want to add that in the middle. Because if you add that at the beginning, all those little bits of meat actually just kind of get coated with wet egg, and they kind of do weird things in the pan. So if you wait until they're halfway cooked to add the already cooked meat, remember when you add meat to your eggs, you want it to be already cooked because this pan will not get hot enough to cook raw meat. So add your pre-cooked meat to the eggs in the middle so that the eggs kind of have their own thing going on before you add the meat, and they come together, but they don't just melt together and become one weird gelatinous mass. If you're adding cheese to your scrambled eggs, you need to add them at the end, and there's a very important scientific reason for this. So cheese is an emulsion, like mayonnaise is an emulsion. An emulsion is basically where you take fat and water, and they stay together in one mass. And like we all know that oil and water don't mix, but they do emulsify. So they kind of like wrap each other around each other's molecules and become one mass, which is why we have things like mayonnaise. But cheese, in and of itself, kind of that block of cheese that just stands there on your counter, is also an emulsion. It's a solid emulsion, but it will break if you heat it too quickly and if you heat it too much. So when you're cooking eggs in your pan, eggs tend to need a little bit like higher temperature to come together. I cook my eggs at a low temperature, but that temperature is still too much for cheese. Like you do not want to melt cheese over high temperature. You want to slowly melt it, kind of like away from the heat. So I always add cheese at the very tail end of my scramble and just kind of stir it and allow it to mix in with the eggs. I turn off the heat and just let the cheese melt into itself. Because if you melt the cheese inside the eggs while you're cooking them, what happens is the cheese breaks and then you get like extra liquid because like the milk liquids separate and then the fat solids separate and you end up with like this weird broken texture, and you can actually like pick up your pan and pour out the excess water, and that is not good ease. And your final key to success with scrambled eggs is this. This is a nonstick pan. So you need a nonstick pan with eggs. Like there is no way in God's green earth that you're gonna be able to make scrambled eggs in a stainless steel pan. I've tried everything. It just doesn't work. Eggs are like the stickiest food on the face of the planet. You need a nonstick pan. And here's the thing about nonstick pans. They are not all made equal. So if you have a really good nonstick pan, this is actually a really good nonstick pan, even though it's not that expensive. I think it's a Zwilling Henkel's pan. I think this pan is like 40 bucks. This pan is amazing. So even though it's like a not so expensive pan, I can actually make eggs in here with 0 fat and they just come right off. I can actually just like take this under the spray thingy in my sink and they just spray off. Like no fat necessary, no added fat, no nothing. It's amazing. If you have a frying pan, a nonstick frying pan that isn't that great, it's kind of a meh pan, you're gonna need to add fat, right? Like I have a couple frying pans that like, they look great, like they have a beautiful nonstick surface like this. As soon as you put an egg in there, like they stick. Like they stick less than a stainless steel pan, but for whatever reason, they still stick really bad. So if you find that your nonstick pan sticks the eggs really bad, just add like a tablespoon of olive oil or a little bit of butter and that'll get you going.